Thanks for joining me. Today we are going to work with black cardstock and we're going to walk on the dark side. Thanks for joining me for part 2 of this series on the dark side of card making, where we're using our black card bases, which is a little outside of the norm for me. In this one, we're going to use our Distress Oxide inks on our embossing folder, and I'm going to use it on the raised. I have the image where the butterflies are raised, and so they'll become recessed when I emboss it. I'm just going to use some of my Distress Oxide inks and create some color in these butterflies. And the Distress Oxide inks are nice to use for this because they stay nice and wet for a longer period of time, so as I decide which colors I want to add, they're not going to dry and everything will come across when I use my die cutting and embossing machine. So I'm going to speed this up significantly so that you don't have to watch me decide what parts of the butterflies I want to make purple or pink or red or green, but I use my Distress Oxides and just basically color in a lot of this. If I were to use the other side of this embossing folder, the background would be what would come across with ink on it. So I wanted the butterflies and the flowers and the stems of the flowers to be the ones that became embossed into the paper, and so they'll look recessed with color on them when I use my embossing machine. And I'm using full strength Distress Oxides here because you want the ink to stay pretty wet and when we go to emboss it. The colors I used for this project were the Distress Oxide colors of Candied Apple. Rustic Wilderness is what I'm using here. I also used Twisted Citron, Seedless Preserved, Picked Raspberry, and Peacock Feathers as well. I'm trying to use the Rustic Wilderness on a lot of the stems of the flowers. For the Candied Apple, I'm using that on a lot of the flowers and a couple of the butterflies as well. The nice thing about using some Distress Oxide inks is that you can use different colors on the same butterfly and they don't get muddy looking. Okay, now I'm going to put my black card front into it, and then you want to make sure you hold it pretty tight while you're messing around trying to get your embossing machine set up, because you don't want it to move around and move that ink around. So I'm holding it pretty tightly in my fingers, and then I put it inside in the sandwich there. I'll put it through a couple of times, and that came out beautifully. I also sprayed some water on that embossing folder, and so I'm going to just take a piece of a white piece of scrap, and I'm going to just see what that does if I emboss that piece of paper. I love to reuse ink, and so I don't waste all of that Distress Oxide ink and make another card base or make another card front background sheet. We'll make a bonus card out of that later on in the video, so stay tuned for that extra card. So I used 2 pieces of paper by mistake when I embossed that scrap piece of paper, and so I'm going to try another technique here where I'm just going to color in, using some of these daubers, color in some of the areas of this embossed image. This is another technique you can use either on white or dark cardstock, and it just creates a totally different look. It's more of a watercolor-ish look to me. I'm just making sure the background is kind of colored that Rustic Wilderness color, and again I'm just using the ink that I had on the dauber, so nothing additional. You can also swipe some ink over it, but because I wanted to use lots of different colors, I'm choosing to use the daubers, and I'm dabbing them a little bit, but I'm also swiping them where there's a lot of detail. I'm going to be able to get 3 background pieces from one embossing folder, and that's kind of fun. This one is just the embossed image from the embossing folder, and I'm just using some leftover ink. It's a kind of a messy look, but it's pretty at the same time, kind of that watercolor feel to it. But they come out pretty vibrantly. The other one where I embossed it with the ink that was sprayed with water is a little bit more muted and it's a little messier. I'm adding just a little bit to the other one because it was missing ink in some spots. Those came out pretty cute considering they were kind of add-ons. So back to the original one that we're working on. And this one, as I'm looking at the image, there's some nice areas where I can kind of cut around and make this background design into 2 pieces. So I'm going to pull out my small bladed Tim Holtz scissors. I'm just going to find a natural break in this design and I'm going to cut around it, and then I will find a sentiment that I can kind of put in the middle of that. I'm cutting down the side because that's where the embossing folder ended, so no need to have that on there. So I could have just used that, or I can use the top piece as well, and I think I'm going to go ahead and use that top piece, but I'm going to cut a big chunk off of it so that I have room for a sentiment. And that should give me plenty of room for sentiment in there. And again, on this one, I will cut the parts that the embossing folder didn't quite reach to. What would you have done in this one? Would you have left the top one off or put both pieces on there? Let me know in the comments below. So here's a thinking of you sentiment that I'm going to put in the center, and I just set it where I wanted it, and I'm going to pull out my stamping platform, take off the backing, and then we will emboss this sentiment. I'm going to use my Hero Hues Unicorn White pigment ink for this sentiment. I'm also going to preheat my heat gun. And what I'm not doing here is I forgot to use my cornstarch bag. And on black cardstock, that can be a bit of a problem if you get white ink all over the place. I didn't handle the card base very much, so hopefully not a lot will happen with cornstarch bag not being used. Here's where I realized it. So I pull out my cornstarch bag and think that I'm maybe going to put it a little bit around. And then I decided to use a pretty color. It's a muted green color. It's a Lindy's brand, and it's merry-go-round green, and it's a little muted green color that's really pretty, but yet, stark enough against that black base, and it's got some shimmer to it as well. So I thought it was a really pretty choice, especially with this much green as we have in this image. So when you use a cornstarch bag on black cardstock, it does leave a little bit of residue. So I try to wipe it off with a rag, but you'll still see it there a little bit. It's not terrible though, and you really can't tell when you put the other two pieces on there, but look how that sentiment stands out. And I'm going to again put some ink around the edges of the two pieces, and again that just gives it a little bit more definition so that it doesn't meld into that card base. And I'll struggle a little bit when we get to that inner edge, so I'll use a dauber to get to that part. And I'm using Twisted Citron for this. I thought it might match that sentiment pretty well, or at least coordinate with it. It's not like the exact same color. Okay, and then we're going to next adhere those two pieces to our card base. I'm going to try and wipe that black off of that card base again. I'm not sure I love that Twisted Citron around the edges. I thought it would act a little bit like a matting layer, but I'm not sure I love it. I thought about adding another matting layer, but then changed my mind on that. But I am going to put a pretty green color on the inside, and I'm just going to use a tape runner to adhere it. And I did end up using a matting layer. I'm using this pale purple lavender color. And now I'm just going to dry this because I use the distressed oxide. I want to make sure that none of the ink is still wet so that I transfer it anywhere else on this dark card. And then I'm just going to fussy cut that out of the matting layer. And I wanted to have a very small amount of that matting layer on there. I just didn't love it with the Twisted Citron only on it. Maybe no layer would have been better, and just left it alone as just a black on some foam tape would have been fine too. Now we're going to attach it to the card. And because I make my own envelopes, if it doesn't exactly match, I can trim down the card base a little bit. And that's what I'll end up doing here. But I'm going to first pop this up onto some foam tape to even give it a little bit more dimension raised up around that sentiment. And I didn't even have to bend that sentiment to make it fit there perfectly, but it looks like it was actually made for it. And here I am overdoing the tape again, the foam tape. And so here I'll use my long bladed scissors just to trim off that edge piece. But I forgot about the green piece on the inside, so we'll need to unattach that and cut it down and reattach it. I thought because there was a piece sitting there that I hadn't done this yet, but I had already cut that out and put it inside. I'm going to grab my pops of color. So for the pops of color, if you tap the back of it, it will stop it from being so pointed at the top where the tip of the dot becomes. And it'll flatten it out a little bit and make it look more like a gem embellishment, but it still has a lot of dimension. One thing you have to be careful of when you're using these is not touching them while they're drying. I've done that in the past where I've worked all around a card and inadvertently put my hand or my arm in it. That one had an air bubble in it. I got it out before it became a problem. Pops of color are super easy to use. It seems like you just barely touch them and you get a nice even dot. They take a little bit of practice. And again, just a quick little tap and that'll stop it from having those pointed tips. And I think that turned out really pretty as well. But I want something in those empty spaces on the corners of the sentiment. So I'm going to use these butterfly stickers again, and they're raised stickers, so that'll look pretty. And then, do I use a green one? Do I use a pink one? I went to use a green one and said nope. I decided to use just a slightly different colored pink one. And I'll add some butterflies on the inside of that card. after I set it aside to dry. Now for our bonus card. So I'm going to use our extra piece with the butterflies on it. So we're using a lot of butterflies today. It was a piece of scrap paper, so it's pretty small. Okay, we'll add a sentiment, and I've decided I'm going to measure this and then cut it into thirds. First I'm going to measure it, and then I'm going to cut off the little parts that the embossing folder missed. And then here you can see I'm measuring it to see what I have. And then you don't see this, but I yell out to Alexa and I say, Alexa, what is a third of the measurement? And she gives it to me, and then I cut it out into thirds. No need to do math on your own when it's fractions. So this is a black card base. You've got that nice definition between the card front and the card base. And then I have room for a sentiment as well. But I've decided I want to have just a little bit of a border, so I'm going to use this pretty purple paper, and I'm going to use my Ranger Multimedia Matte Finish glue. And I sometimes like to use that because it allows me to move the paper a little bit, got a little wiggle room in it, whereas my Barely Art Precision Craft glue dries a lot faster, I think, because the tip is so precise. It just doesn't give out as much glue, so you work a little bit faster. So I'm going to adhere these all to this purple piece of paper and then just cut them out with my long bladed scissors. And if I cut them out in one big bunch first, then I'll know that they all will have a similar width to it when I put them on the paper. These are all my happy birthday sentiments that are dies. So I'm going to add these to it and see how much space I actually have. Too much space for any of these happy birthday dies, which is fine. I have a lot of happy birthday cards. I actually would like a congratulations card if I can make one. Here is a perfect sentiment. I do put pre-cut out die cuts I put in the back of those clear envelopes for future use. And then here, if you haven't used a die and you've got those little metal pieces between the shadow die and the other die, you could just use little snips like this, and it just gets those little bits out of the way for you. A lot of times I've used this sentiment before and I just didn't cut out the shadow piece. I just used it and cut out two. So I did like two of one color and two of the other color, and then I just swap them, and that's what you see in the back of that clear folder, clear envelope. In this case I wanted just to have the black congratulations and then the shadow to be in the same purple color as the layering, the matte layer. I'm going to die cut these two out. And ever since I flattened my cutting plates, I'm having a much easier time with my sentiments coming out perfectly cut out. If you haven't seen that, I'll link that video. I have a method on flattening your cutting plates, so you can watch that video here. I'm going to pop out the little pieces out of, I was looking for my craft tweezers that have a more pointed edge, but I couldn't find them at the moment, so I'm going to try and use these thicker ones, and then at the end of the day I'm going to have to get a pin to help me with this. I have a pin in my Barely Art Precision Craft glue, and so I use that because most of your dies have a little hole so that you push out the sentiment, and that helps quite a bit. Alright, so I used that. Sentiment came out perfectly, and that's a really pretty script. And I'll add that to the back. Now, had I used my Sizzix sheets, that would have been super helpful, but I didn't, so I'll just put little dots of glue all over this sentiment, and it'll work out just fine. This Barely Art Precision Craft glue does dry matte, so if you do get a little glue, not a problem. And I was a little aggressive there. It is a very delicate piece, so I did tear it apart, but that's okay. It didn't hurt anything. You can't even tell. We'll get up some of that excess glue with my rag, and we'll put that there. And I'm not going to put these on any foam tape. I'm just going to glue these on, and I'm going to have to leave very little room because that sentiment needs to have a little bit of space. I'm putting this pretty close to the top, and I decided to do the top and the bottom. That's the easiest way when you have to measure pieces. Do the top and the bottom, and then the middle one, it'll figure out its place, but it's hard when you run out of room at the bottom and then it doesn't look even. So that's why I stopped when I had that middle piece. And the last thing I have to do here is adhere this sentiment. I decided that I wanted to pop it up into foam tape. I had a little bit of glue on there, but not a problem. It'll just keep that foam tape on there even more secure. But it just gives it a little bit of dimension, that sentiment. And I'm going to cut off that edge with my long bladed scissors. Again, I make my own envelopes. If you want to see the video where I teach you how to make envelopes, I do mostly my own envelopes, but I show how to use a tool. There's two methods that I teach, and I will link that video above as well. So now I'm going to work on the inside of this card, and I thought I would use some of these these little strips that I cut off. I often use those little strips, which may seem silly, but they actually look pretty good, and just tie it all together. But I'm going to use some lavender paper on the inside because it's nice and light, so you can write on the inside of your card. And then I have some room between the top and the bottom, so that's where those little strips will come in. So doesn't it look cute when you see the little coordinating colors from the front of the card? And all these would be things that you're going to throw away, so might as well use those scraps while you can. I like to use my scraps in the same project, so I'm not putting them in some big container of the leftovers scraps. Time for some embellishments. So I'm going to put a couple of these butterfly stickers on the inside. And then I was like, should I put some on the front of the card as well? Decisions. Or do I put some gem embellishments? And I'm putting that on the eye and congratulations. So just one gem embellishment on that. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of glue inside of these butterflies so that the small gem embellishments don't move around. I'm going to use some white. These are little pearls. They're very, very tiny. I'm going to use the white on this bright blue butterfly. This is not my normal tweezers, so they're driving me crazy. As the gems keep flying all over the place. I decided to use them on the sideways, and they seem to work a little bit better that way, but I definitely need to find my other pair because they are my tried and true. So putting a few gem embellishments in the centers of the butterflies like I've done in some of the other cards, and I think that just is a great place to put gem embellishments with butterflies. And my glue's drying on this last butterfly, so I just took some off the tip of the glue bottle. And I'm going to pull out these stickers again and see if I want to add some by that sentiment strip where there's some extra space. Extra space, we'll cover it. And then it didn't feel even, so I put one on the other side too. And I like that card a lot. And that was all because we had that extra piece that we used from our Distress Oxide inks. Now let's go through each of the cards we made, and this was from part 1. This is the Happy Birthday to You card we made with Distress Oxides. And I will put a link to part 1 in the description box below. This is the card we made today with the Distress Oxides recessed using our embossing folder. This is also from part 1. This is using the resist technique. On the inside we put some butterflies, and I did end up actually using some markers to make those a little bit more fun on the inside of that card. And then this is the last card we made today. This is a congratulations card, and it was our bonus card because we used some of those Distress Oxides leftovers. And that's the inside of that card. If you would, please hit the like button if you enjoyed this content today. And also you can subscribe to my channel. I do create 2 videos per week. And then if you hit the notification bell, you're notified of when those 2 videos come out. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching.